think I'm going to get started. So I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. My name is Andy Kleek, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director at NYU's McSilver Institute, where I oversee all of our Technical Assistance Center, including the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, or MCTAC, which is presenting this webinar today. We're really excited to have everybody here. I'm going to give one additional word of housekeeping before we get started. Today, we're doing this as a webinar and not as, we're doing this as a meeting and not as a webinar so that we can break folks up a bit as well. So if you take yourself off mute, we may be able to hear what you're talking about. So please make sure we keep you, you keep yourself on mute when you're not talking, so that we're not hearing in on your conversations as well. So I'm really excited for this webinar in our series on working with boards. So this webinar is on Board of Directors and DEIB, embedding diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into Board of Directors functioning. So I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping things, and then we'll turn it over to our distinguished guest today. So a couple of housekeeping things. Yes, the slides will be available, as will the recording after the webinar. So it usually takes us 24 to 48 hours to get all that processed. And up and on our MCTAC CTAC website, so you can access that there. You can use Zoom to raise your hand or use the chat bot to chat in questions. We will continue to monitor the chat over the course of the webinar, and there'll be some times where we take questions as we go. This is part of a series. We had our first webinar on governance versus management on April 24th. If you're interested in that webinar and you were not able to attend, it is up on the ctacny.org website, and you can download it, watch it, get the slides, do all of that as well. Today is our DEIB webinar. We're having a webinar on June 20th on recruiting, onboarding, and assessment for boards. And then we're going to be having a bunch more of these webinars in the fall, and we will announce all of those topics and dates as soon as they become available. One disclaimer: the information contained within this presentation is intended to assist New York State behavioral health providers to explore key responsibilities and the important role that non-for-profit board members occupy. This presentation must be understood as a resource for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for legal advice. The organizations are encouraged to consult both federal and state guidelines for information related to nonprofit boards. So we're going to give you fantastic information, but this information is not a substitute for any legal advice or any policies and procedures or bylaws that you may currently have as a board. So getting all the fun disclosure and housekeeping stuff out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists and presenters today, Jackie Negri and Keith Little. And with that, I will pass this on to them.
Thank you. Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. We look forward to today's presentation, and we do want to make it interactive. So we encourage you to use the chat and or ask questions throughout. We want to make this a dialogue because when you talk about DEIB, it is an ongoing dialogue. It evolves, it's ongoing learning. So we hope to bring that to you today. I wanted to start with a quote, and this is, learning the difference between shared power with versus power over. And power with is shared power that grows out of collaborations, relationships. These relationships are built out of respect, mutual support, solidarity, influence, and collaborative decision-making. It is the influence we wield among equals rather than domination and control. Power with leads to collective action and the ability to act together. So we're using that sort of our framework for today as we continue with the discussion on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. What we're going to be covering in today's session, we're going to speak a little bit to implicit bias. We're going to speak to what is DEIB in an organization and why it's essential that every organizations and every board of directors incorporate DEIB in their governance plan. We're going to also give you some tips as to how it can be embedded in your board governance plan. To start, we'd like to take a couple polls to see where you are with your organization. So we're going to start with the first poll. If they could launch that. And often with DEIB, and why we're here today, is we want to make certain that DEIB is not only within the organization and the staff, but is also within the governing body. So our first poll is asking your organization that you govern, how many have a DEIB statement for the organization? Just give you a few more seconds here.
Tell me when you want me to end it, Jackie.
For some reason, Andy, we're not seeing it, so I'm trying to troubleshoot
Oh,
this.
no,
really
people are.
Oh, okay.
we-
Maybe you're just the host, so you could see it.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay.
All
We can
right.
go ahead and end the poll.
Everybody see the results?
So it looks as about almost half of the participants have a DEIB statement. About a quarter do not, and encouraging that the rest are in progress. So that's very helpful to get a baseline of where you are with your organization. Can you launch the second poll?
Yep, hold on.
And then how many have a DEIB committee? And when you answer this, you'll see the part 2. Is it board and staff as a partnership? Is it board only that runs the DEIB committee? Or is it just within the organization that staff's running your DEIB committee? Again, how many have a DEIB committee? If you do, is it a partnership and representative of both your board and staff? Is it your board only? Or is it internal to the organization staff only? You want to end the poll? And again, we're almost split here. It's just about equal that many of the organizations have a DEIB committee, but the same do not.
Yeah.
Those who do, about a quarter of them are board and staff. Very few are board only, but it looks like it's primarily staff driven. So as we work toward today's presentation, we will speak to sort of the importance of that ongoing partnership.
And Jackie, you had a question come in. What is the difference between a DEIB statement and equal opportunity statement?
That's a good question. An DEIB statement should encompass all of your diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, how you govern the entire organization, how you embed it within the organization. An equal opportunity is usually more so for the workforce. Keith?
Yeah, I think the other thing we should realize with an EEOC statement, it's a federal mandate, it's a federal law. When we're talking about DEIB, it's not a law, it's a culture that you create within your organization. So that's one of the other differences.
Thanks. So as we move forward, as we talk about culture, we're going to start with one of the first steps in moving forward is understanding what is implicit bias. And implicit bias are sort of subconscious feelings, right? That one has. It could be over a period of time, your lifetime, based on past experiences. They could be formed as a form of prejudice, a form of stereotypes, and it can be in all areas. It could be gender, it could be race, it could be, religion. And the first is to have a good understanding of where your team, and when we talk about team, we're talking about the organization, your executive staff, your staff within the organization, and you as a board. So it's good on the governing side to start the conversation with the board of directors and maybe use some tools that talk about unconscious bias and implicit bias. There are assessment tools out here. We have put links to them. There's many. We're not endorsing any particular one, but there's a lot of opportunity for you to think about where is a good starting point for conversation. Usually that starting point starts with determining where your team's implicit biases is a good first step in starting the dialogue towards diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. DEIB in and of itself is, as Keith said, a culture. And we're going to move toward some slides that allow the opportunity for us to get a better understanding of how to incorporate DEIB in the culture of your organization as a governing body. Keith?
Yeah, thank you, Jackie, and good afternoon to everyone that's attending. If we can go to the next slide, because we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And it's a term that sometimes can be challenges to really grasp and integrate into your organization. So we're going to go through and we're going to dissect each one of the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So let me start with the diversity piece. The diversity piece, and I think a lot of organizations, particularly board of directors and organizations in the nonprofit sector, have done a good job of looking at diversity. And what that is employing and engaging people with a range of different social identities, not just race, but includes culture, sexual orientation, religion, political beliefs, and gender identity differences. And so I think a lot of organizations over the last probably decade, definitely within the last 5 years, have really diversified in a way. Let's go to the next slide. The challenge has come with equity, inclusion, and belonging, and some have been able to make substantial progress and others are a work in progress. So when we talk about equity, it's really the concept of providing fair treatment and opportunities to all. Next slide. Then we come to inclusion. Implementing systems that ensure all employees, regardless of background, social identity, feel involved, valued, respected, and treated fairly. To create an inclusive organization, there's really that empowerment of board members is needed to encourage them to feel comfortable and being themselves. And I'm just going to say something real quickly. As you think about growing your board and as you think about diversifying your board, what happens sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, is we get so focused on diversifying that we forget about the inclusion piece. And the inclusion piece, I'll give you an example. Diversifying is finding BIPOC individuals, people with lived experience, people with different social identities to come onto your board. The inclusion part is to make sure that they are integral part of the board. Could be things such as them being a part of the executive committee of the board or being one of the officers. Could be them being a committee chair. So it's making sure that they're included and not sitting by and just there to check off a box. Next slide. Belonging. Nurturing a sense of security so that every board member feels that they're accepted, supported, and included. And then I want to go to the next slide because it shows the difference between inclusion and belonging. And this is important. As we look at the difference between inclusion and belonging, I know when I first was exposed to this, I didn't see the difference, but I truly do now. And so inclusion is efforts and actions and activities that the board takes to promote equal opportunities. Belonging is how the recipient feels in terms of being included in the process. Do they feel they belong because those inclusion actions have taken place and they've been effective? Next slide. So now that we've gone through D, E, I, and B, and we have an understanding of those, we wanted to talk about how do we embed DEIB within an organization? That's the important part. Normally, you get the DEIB because you've gone through some sort of training and you've had discussions and you're gung-ho and you're really committed to doing it. And some organizations then get stuck because they're trying to figure out, now, how do we truly embed DEIB within the organization, both at the board level and at the staff and organizational level? Let's go to the next slide. So the way we envision it is that as it relates to DEIB, there has to be an organizational commitment at 3 levels. One is at the board level, 2 is at the executive leadership level because they really manage the organization day to day, and 3rd is at the staff level. And if you do it at these 3 levels, it becomes part of the culture and it permeates the organization. And they're not 3 different entities, they feed off of each other. The board has interactions with the executive leadership and staff, and vice versa. So there's a culture within the organization of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Next slide. We talk about board commitment and thought it would be good to talk about why and how. And we see 2 ways in which there's a board commitment. One is within the functioning of the board of directors, separate from the rest of the organization. It speaks to the idea of diversifying the board. It speaks to the idea of being inclusive and equitable in terms of board operations, making sure that there's representation, but making sure there is a good give and take and a good value placed to every board member, no matter race, creed, color, ethnicity, religion, sexual identity. And then the other is, if the board is looking at themselves within their functioning, then the second part is viewing the rest of the organization. What is executive leadership? What is staff doing? And looking at it not in terms of a management lens, but looking at it in how it relates to governance. So being able to assess that the overall organization is embedding DEIB within it. And that from an oversight view, which is what board of directors are required to do, that they're ensuring that it is happening without managing the process. Next slide. Stepping stones to board commitment. We see a number of different ways in which commitment can be shown. And boards have done that, and we would recommend that if you're not there yet, that you're considering these 5 different ways in which DEIB can be embedded into the process. One would be assessing where you're at in terms of your commitment to DEIB. One of the things, there is a continuum. It's called an anti-racist multicultural continuum. We don't have a copy of it, but we can provide it. It's a good barometer of doing a self-assessment of where organizations are, but it's also a way of doing a self-assessment of where the board is as it relates to DEIB. The other part would be is once you've done the self-assessment, is there a need for training? A lot of times there is a need for training and education to understand diversity, equity, inclusion, and how to be an anti-racist organization. The third part is critical in terms of discussion. And some of those discussions will be uncomfortable, some of them will be comfortable, but all of them are necessary to move organizations forward. And those discussions take place within the board, but those discussions can also and should take place within the executive leadership of the organization. Fourth would be actions. What do we need to do as board of directors to kind of change the dynamics and move things along and ensure that we're committed and that we're looking at all opportunities to be DEIB organizations? And then the last part is looking at policies and practices. And those policies and practices are not just at the board level, they're within the administration of the organization and looking at them. Are they equitable practices? Are they fair? Do they take into account all of the employees within the organization? Next slide. So we have here yep.
Oh, I thought you were gonna pass. Go ahead, or you can
Oh, I'm
pass
going
it
to pass
either
it to you. I'm sorry.
way. Pass the baton, right, great. So thanks. When we started and talk about the DEIB committees, this is a real integral component for any organization. And as Keith said, it can be uncomfortable conversations, which is okay. We just want to validate that it's okay to have conversations within your own governing body and with your staff, with your executive team that may be uncomfortable, as long as you have sort of a guiding principle that you want to move forward with, encompassing DEIB and everything that the organization does. So as we, noted at the beginning, some of you have mission statements, policy statements already, others do not. We encourage DEIB committees that are partnerships between the staff and the board. It shouldn't be a secluded group that sort of works against inclusivity, right? It should be a group that allows the opportunity for input, we would say, from all of the staff, not just maybe the C-suite of the organization as well, but allow all of your staff to, whether it's through polls, whether it's through surveys, whether it's through focus groups, to really talk about the importance of incorporating DEIB in the work of the organization. So when you go to develop a DEIB mission statement, have a cross sort of group of staff, C-suite executives, board members who may come up, because words are important. Words are extremely important in DEIB, and we want to make sure that when you're doing this work, that it's an open process. We also encourage organizations to develop principles and values that you can get behind as a board, principles and values that your team, your workforce understands, and also principle and values that as a board and as a executive team, they can use those related to the mission of your organization. So whether you're meeting with other collaborators in the community, whether you're meeting with doing fundraising, that everyone who is part of your circle of the organization, both internal and external, understands the commitment and of DEIB for this particular organization. Some of the board's role is to make sure that the executive is prioritizing DEIB in the work setting, that it's just not a rubber stamp, because we see that often in organizations. Let's write together a mission statement, let's put it on our website, something quick, let's move forward, and then that's the end of it. As Keith alluded to earlier, it's a culture, it's embracing the culture. So it's ongoing, it's evolving, and it should be on your board agenda, throughout the year, to make sure that you're checking back in. What have we learned? What are we continuously learning? That's the only way really to improve the organization's culture, is to make sure there's continuous dialogue and continuous learning. The other area within the board is, as Keith gets into some of the policies and practices, a DEIB committee can start to identify where are there inequities within the organization, bring those to management's attention, and also, if it's a governance issue, to the governing body, the board's attention as well. Keith will get into now a little bit more about.
I'm just going to add one thing, Jackie,
Go ahead,
in
Keith.
terms of committee, and I've learned this through organizations that I've worked at. Think of the DEIB committee as the engine and the conscience for your organization. They're not the end all and be all. I think there are times where DEIB committees, there's an assumption by boards and there's an assumption by leadership, the executive leadership, that they're going to do everything, that they're going to satisfy every need of the organization. And really what they're there to do is to be the facilitator, the conscience of the organization, the engine to get things started, and to make sure that DEIB is embedded in all levels of the organization. So don't think of them as the end all and the be all, is my point.
Very good, thanks. And that makes me think of another point. We've worked with organizations where we've worked in, with the DEIB committee. And even when it's integrated with some board members, when it came time to present to the board of directors, not everyone may have been on the same page. So sometimes you think you're moving within like minds, but it's very important that there's inclusivity and opportunity for dialogue. So do not get discouraged if your DEIB committee, as Keith was saying, it's ongoing, the subconscious of the organization, but they will continue to roll up their sleeves and move issues forward. Keith?
Great, thank you. So we thought it would be good to give maybe some examples of how board of directors can move towards DEI integration. And we're going to go through, we're going to give you a few examples which might resonate. And these are actual examples. One would be in the area of board recruitment. We talked about diversifying, and we talked about diversifying by race, age, gender, but also lived experience. It is important that you have representation from an individual who has lived experience in the business or the service delivery that you provide. So if your organization provides mental health services, having an individual, to be a family member, it could be a recipient of care, who has had lived experience, provides insight to a board of directors and to a leadership that no one else can provide because it's coming from their point of view. And I think it helps in terms of making decisions and policies and practices. So that's an important one. And not a lot of organizations have jumped on the bandwagon yet. More and more are bringing into their boards individuals' lived experience. Second would be policies. I have here HR policies: recruitment, retention, performance evaluations, exit interviews. What I didn't put here is something that I had a challenge with at one of the organizations that I worked at. We had a policy, a HR policy, that spoke about if an employee is arrested, they are subject to be terminated because they got arrested. And we're not talking about convicted, we're talking about arrested. What we realize in terms of looking at that policy is that we know that more and more in our society, Black men are arrested more than any other group. And so we felt that we needed to change that policy because it was a disadvantage and it was inequitable to Black men who had not been convicted of a crime. So looking at recruitment practices through a lens, looking at retention, looking at exit interviews in terms of who's leaving the organization, and if there are any trends, those are important things that boards can look at, not in terms of the management of the organization, but in terms of the big picture, looking at the governance of the organization and how it impacts policies. Equitable hiring and operational procedures that take place, looking at those and making sure that there's equity. Data review, looking at the demographics. One of the things that I looked at my organization when I was working at my last organization was looking at healthcare claims. One of the things I realized is that when we looked at healthcare claims, they heavily were weighted on Black women who had obesity and hypertension issues. And so the first part was identifying that was a trend that disproportionately disadvantage women of color. This more important part is to identify what was the organization going to do to improve healthcare practices for that segment of the population, because we have a responsibility. So looking at that both from an executive leadership, but definitely from a board perspective. Vendor utilization, minority and women-owned business entities. Are vendor teams you engage diverse? That's something we need to, boards need to ask themselves. And then implementing inclusive recruitment strategies. We know there's retention issue and hiring challenges. So making sure that organizations are implemented these recruitment strategies that really open up the organization so that it's diverse and inclusive organization. Next slide. Other examples of DEIB integration at the board level: identifying a BIPOC board member to be officers of the board of directors, not just being on the board, but being, whether it's a chairperson and we're doing succession planning, vice chair, secretary, treasurer, making sure that they have important roles, or a committee chair, as I was mentioning before. Supporting leadership development for BIPOC staff. And I'm assuming that each of you is familiar with the term BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color staff, as part of your overall succession planning. What's going on in terms of leadership development as it pertains to that? We mentioned before about utilization of minority and women-owned businesses as part of your business partnerships. Being able to review staff health insurance claims, as I mentioned before, to see if there are disproportionate trends as it relates to gender, race, age disparities. And the link to finances, because the more claims you have, the more it costs an organization. And lastly, review of outcome disparities for clients by race, age, and residential communities. A lot of the communities that we do serve are socioeconomically deprived and may consist of individuals of color. So being able to look at those through a board lens and to assess why and to ask the right questions. You may not have the answers, but being able to ask the right questions as it relates to disparities. Next slide. Jackie?
Thanks, Keith. So I wanted to bring to your attention as board members and execs, if you're on, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services have developed national class standards, culturally and linguistically appropriate services. And these class standards were intended to advance health equity, improve quality, and help eliminate healthcare disparities by establishing a blueprint for health and healthcare organizations. There's about 15 action steps to these standards, and we included the link. You will get the PowerPoint, but I do encourage everyone to take a look at these standards for a few reasons. One of the critical class components is recruit, promote, and support a culturally and linguistically diverse governance, leadership, and workforce that are responsive to the population in the service area. Now, why is this important? Because for your organization, federal grants, for the most part, are requiring these standards for RFPs. So if you as an organization, board, you decide to go after federal funding, you want to make sure that your organization is taking a look at these standards. OMH is also using these standards as a framework for their RFPs. So not to be confused with that, you must follow these standards to move forward with the OMH RFP, but they're starting to use them as a framework. So you're going to see more, and you probably have seen more diverse sort of language and adhering to some of these standards as well. And the Office of Mental Health is committed to assisting providers to ensure that everyone has equal opportunity to mental wellness. Their Office of Diversity Inclusion is, by far across the country, one of the leading offices. What we've shared with you here are some resources for you as board members, for your management team. These allow supports for mental health providers to create an infrastructure and implement activities to reduce disparities and achieve health quality. You'll see some links here. One is to the office itself, to OMH. OMH is moving away from OMH cultural competence to cultural humility. And cultural humility is more about understanding that this is a lifelong process. It's a little bit more person-centered. So listening to clients' needs and understanding you're bringing maybe your own, what's embedded within you, your own thoughts when working with your clients, but being able to connect those, right? And have that opportunity for ongoing lifelong learning. So you're going to see a move with the Office of Mental Health more towards cultural humility, and within whether it's standards, whether it's, licensing or relicensing, certifications, that's all going to be included in. We share with you some tools here. And these are also on the Office of Mental Health's website. But these tools are something that you can, again, take a look at as board members. Maybe something that you can use with the organization that you're on. Maybe something you and your exec as partners, as we said in our last webinar, partnering together to move DEIB forward within the organization. They've put together a great webinar as well, just on DEIB, not particularly for how to apply it to the board, but you may want to take a look at that or contact OMH for some of the any further information you are interested in from the office. We want to stop here, and before we move on to breakouts, I just want to ask if there's any questions thus far for Keith and I. What we'd like to do is move into breakouts and spend a little bit of time talking about what you're doing in your organization, sharing some of your processes. Is DEIB adequately reflected in your organization's vision, mission, and values? It'd be interesting to hear from you what your processes were, your policies. How did you go about doing it on your board? And also, does your board include DEIB initiatives, current and future, on their board agendas? Before we get into breakouts, Keith and I will be in each one. Is there any overall questions that anyone may have at this time?
I would add one other thing you might want to discuss. This is difficult work, so if you might want to discuss any challenges that you have. No one has the magic potion in terms of getting DEIB exactly right, and I don't know what right is, but you may have challenges, so it would be okay to maybe talk about challenges because there might be someone in your breakout group that might be able to assist you.
All right. And we're going to break folks into two separate breakout groups because we've got a pretty small group today. So we're going to break folks into two breakout groups. Jackie's going to be in one of them and Keith is going to be in the other one. Jackie, do you want to do the poll question first? Or you want to just go right to the groups?
I think we'll go right to the groups and
Okay,
then we
so
can maybe take a
Kiara,
look
if
at
you
that.
can do your
Thanks.
magic and randomly break these groups into two, and then we'll put Jackie in one and Keith in the other. And we'll be there for you guys will be there for about 10 minutes. So you and I are back and everybody is gone.
Yes. Do you want me to put you in a room or?
No, I didn't want to be in a room. So
Okay.
all good. That was exactly. I went into a room and then I came back out again. But that's all. Yeah, that's totally good. All right. So
Okay, perfect.
we got everybody out, and
I'm glad that the poll worked because I couldn't see it, but I think it's because if you're also a host that you can't see it if someone else launches it. So
yeah,
I'm
and
glad.
it's so weird because I don't know why you couldn't launch it because it was like right there for me. But
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad that worked though. That's good.
yeah, no. Well, I'm glad it all worked, and
Perfect.
yeah. And I think when you do webinars at 5 o'clock, you get a lot more drop off than when you do them at 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
But OMH wanted us to do these at night because they're for board members who technically have other jobs.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Kiara, do they automatically come back at the end of a minute or whatever?
Yeah, I'll close it in like the next 30 seconds.
Yeah, it says it's still got a minute left, so. Should we send John Stenson somewhere?
I just put him in room 1.
Okay. All right. Welcome
Welcome back.
back, everybody. I'll give it back to Keith and Jackie.
Oh, Christine was cut off in my group. But we had a lot of great conversation. I could have kept talking for a while longer, all of us. So thank you for that. And Christine, maybe we can connect afterwards because I'm curious what you were saying with your organization. But I just want to take the last few minutes to talk a little bit about, what we've heard. And I know in our group, Keith, folks were at all different stages, but primarily at the beginning stage of moving DEIB through. We had organizations that started with maybe board and exec thinking now about, being more inclusive with their staff. Some had just started and they were pleased that their organizations did have DEIB statements, talked a little bit about how to make sure that the process is an ongoing process. And even in different parts of the state, no matter where you are, there's some, we have to all embrace implicit biases because, one way or another, in order to keep this work moving, that's the first start. What was shared in your group?
Yeah, I think one of the things that came out, I think Maureen, you brought it up, was the need to support developing leaders of color within the organization and how the board plays a role in it. And I was going to mention there's a leadership development program that's in the process of there's a number of leadership development programs. There's a new one that's in the process of being developed for the behavioral health sector, which is mental health and substance use disorders. So there will be opportunities for leadership development. And so I commend Maureen for bringing that up and saying that is a need. How do we develop leaders and as part of succession planning? So I think that was one of the things that resonated in our group.
Right. We had a peer group, and the gentleman was a board member since 2000, if I've got that right. And so they've evolved over the years and are just starting now to pull together committees and in the beginning stages. So I think it's wonderful that these a long-standing board member, instead of tiring at this point in your governance career, Michael, you are, help lifting it up. So that was another great opportunity to listen to.
I missed earlier. I would say I was asked for Association for Independent Living in Baldwin. I don't think I mentioned that, and where Michael Hoffman mentioned his Hands Across Long Island, which I had never heard of, which is very interesting.
Yep.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that.
I'm not totally surprised.
One of the other things that we had in our group, this is a shout out to Melissa. Melissa is not on a board. She is a CEO and it provides a different perspective. And I can relate, just so all of you know, I've served as a CEO for a couple of different organizations. Right now, I am a board chair for a nonprofit organization. So I see both sides of the equation. And so I was happy to hear, and I could relate to what Melissa brought up in terms of her work with the board in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And then John spoke about the efforts that his organization has made to diversify. So there's work taking place, and I think people are moving things forward. It's more of a marathon than it is a sprint, as you talk about DEIB. It's not like a magic wand that you're going to make things different right away. As long as you're committed to doing the work, I think that's the important part.
Yeah, I know, you're absolutely right. And in our conversations, we talked about that it's ongoing, right? There's not going to be a start and a finish. And if there is a start and a finish, then we're really not embracing DEIB throughout the full organization. We had some new board members, first-time board members. So I'd like to give a plug that you watched the session we did previously, so you know the role of the board versus governance versus management. Because we want to make sure it's a partnership, and we find that the strongest organizations are those that have real good, solid partnerships between the governance, the governing board members, and the executive director, the CEO, so that especially when you're talking about these sensitive topics, that you have a safe place, right? And that there's opportunity to have this discussion, these dialogues. We had a poll. I just wanted to maybe pull that up before we finish here. Just, curious, because often with organizations, and we applaud the office for offering, this training, but we're wondering how many of you board
Poll
members
should
on
be up
today's
now.
Great, thanks. How many board members on today's presentation have participating before today in DEIB training offered by your agency or outside of the agency? So how many of your own organizations they offered you as board members trainings, or is it outside of the agency?
Or is it both?
Or both, right? So it looks like we can end that poll. So about 38% we're seeing the agencies have offered. So I applaud that. And about 63% outside of the agency from somewhere else. So clearly all of you today who are here are interested in, moving DEIB within your organizations. If you are a board member, even CEO, I heard a few CEOs, really give consideration to offering trainings, offering opportunity for shared dialogue amongst your board members and, not only your staff with your staff training, but to your board as well. There's nothing better than having, and we'll get into this as we do more of our meetings and more productive meetings, having that opportunity to share insights, share experiences as we, did right within our own breakouts. So that would be fabulous if we could see that increase to what Keith said, where both are 100%. You're getting it from your agency and you're getting it from outside organizations, training dollars for that as well. Any other closing comments? Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, I was just thinking about something. I have a question for Andy. Andy, is it okay if Jack and I offer technical assistance to any boards that really need some type of assistance to move along their DEIB initiatives?
Yeah, and actually, yeah, it's totally fine. And actually, the next slide, I believe, or the slide after that, I've lost the ability to share. So if Kiara, you can move the slides forward. There we go, has you guys' contact information. So MCTAC North, I'm going to just do my disclaimer. MCTAC North and State are endorsing Keith or Jackie in a formal way, but their contact information is here, and anybody should absolutely feel free to reach out to them if they're interested in more information.
I will say one other thing, and I'm trying not to plug ourselves, but Jackie and I have worked together on DEIB for probably the last 10 years in a number of organizations. So I think there's a commitment there, and we've kind of learned what we do know and where we can be helpful, and we've learned what we don't know, and we've gotten better at it. So happy to help if you do need our help.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Feel free to send us an email, reach out. I really encourage everyone to take a look at the tools and if you have any questions about them, give a shout out. We're just an email away. Let us know, but take a look at those tools, because the more that I find with DEIB and working with organizations, nonprofits, the more I dive, the deeper, the more I learn. And it's always really refreshing to have the conversations. And I wish we started the conversation a little bit earlier because there's a lot of good learning and sharing out there. And again, I stress the importance of safe space so that we're all learning, right? There is no answer if no one has this answer, but let's continue to learn, lift each other up and, be part of an inclusive community. So with that, I wish everyone good night and thank you.
Yes,
Angie, if you have
thank you to
anything
Keith
Thanks a
and
lot.
Jackie for joining today. We really appreciate your time. And thank you for all of you joining, because I know we do these meetings at the end of the day explicitly because we know a lot of board members have regular things they have to do during the day. So we want to thank everybody for taking the time to join today, and Keith and Jackie as well. So thank you all very much.